Hi. So today we're going to be continuing with our last topic, which is sustainability in the local San Diego region. We started with water, and we'll be moving on today to automobility, highways, sprawl, and suburbia. What are the consequences of this type of settlement, social organization, and transportation? Why are we setting our cities up, our settlements up this way? Is it sort of an inevitable result of human population growth? We have more people and we need somewhere to put them. Or is the story more complicated? If we made different choices, if we set things up differently, would we have different, more sustainable outcomes? And so that's what we'll be talking about today. A couple of questions to sort of warm us up. And you can just answer these questions for yourself. I have spent most of my life living in a suburb. True for me, yes. And typically, we usually do this in class. We're online right now. Many people in the class answered yes. I grew up in a house that had a large lawn or a lawn. Personally, for me, also yes. And I grew up in Reno, Nevada, where it's a desert and 100% of the consumptive water is used for agriculture. We literally don't have water there, but we have lots of large lawns. And last, I usually, if we were actually coming to campus right now, drive to school alone. Is this true for you or not? And for those of you that drove to school, that typically drive to school, myself included, the question is why? Typically we hear, oh yeah, it's convenient, we like our cars. I would love a convenient public transportation system right now. I could get work done while I was riding the transit system. I wouldn't have to worry about gas, insurance, parking, all this other stuff that comes with driving. And so many of us drive because of sort of convenience or because of our schedule, but also because we don't really have other viable alternatives or options that work for us. Like, for example, I work at SDSU and I also teach at Palomar in San Marcos. I teach 4 different classes, 2 different days at each school with different times every single semester, anywhere from 8 a.m. up in San Marcos to 8 p.m. at San Diego State. So public transportation is really not an option for me. I have to be different places all over the county, close together, and there's just not really an alternative that can do that for me other than driving right now. And so many of us, even if we don't want to drive, we don't really have a lot of other options available to us. And this is not an accident. This is not a reflection of the fact that people just like cars. That is not the whole story. And so a main question for today is sprawl natural? Sprawl, the spread out of our settlement. Is the U.S. love of the automobile, the love of driving? We all have our own personal cars. Is this why we drive? Because we love it, because that's what we want. If you take sort of the individual, the default frame that focuses on individuals, what they want, what they do, the story is that we have sprawl, we have lots of cars because people like to live in the suburbs and they like to drive. If this is true, then it would seem sprawl and automobility would be somewhat inevitable fate. If this is not true, if it's not inevitable fate, is the story more complex? Were there choices? Is there other options that we could have taken? Quick question. What percent of housing cities that will be built needed because of population growth by 2050 are not yet built? What percent has not yet been built? And the answer to that is 2/3, and by some estimates, much higher. And so we have lots of choices about where and how those houses are built. Focusing on a more structural, organizational view of why we are where we are today might give us some insight into potentially more sustainable alternatives to sprawl and automobility. If you take a structural organizational view, meaning look at how the system has been set up over time, politically, economically, socially, taking a structural organizational view creates a different view. Driving cars, sprawl development do not equal inevitable fate. They are a result of specific choices that have been made by people over time, and also specific policies, especially subsidies. Where do we spend our tax dollars? And so to assess this question of is sprawl, is automobility inevitable fate, we're going to ask a couple of questions. One, were our choices just natural? choosing to drive, choosing to live in sprawled developments. Are these alone our choices? And would different choices lead to different outcomes? The way things are set up today is not something God wanted. It's not something that's inevitable or set in stone. It's about choices, policy choices, and in many cases, perverse subsidies that have created and even incentivized sprawl and car use. The cartoon on the side, that's from the New Yorker, I think. The cartoon is sort of the end of the affair. You know, people are sick of cars. We were promised freedom and liberty over 100 years ago, and all we've gotten is a burden, rising gas prices, all these other problems. And it's a dysfunctional marriage. She's been cheating on the car with public transit, bicycles, all these other suitors that she's looking to switch over to. It's a silly joke. And so you should have read for today an article by Steinberg in The Obsessive Quest for the Perfect Lawn. 2 chapters from the book, his book, one on Live Free and Mow, about the rise of the green lawn. Why do we have lawns in the US? Why is that a thing? And how many of you have really thought about that before today? Maybe some of you because you're in sustainability. And then the second chapter, the Levitt legacy, which essentially explains the factorization, the Fordism, the McDonaldization, as I like to call it, of housing. Factory, mass-produced housing. And the lawn is an important part of that. So if you haven't, make sure that you read this. It'll be relevant. And so just in basic terms, before talking about Steinberg, first, externalities. Externalities are things that are not priced into the actual cost of something. It's not included in the price tag. These costs, be it social or environmental, are externalized. So that when you fly on an airplane, you pay for the ticket, you pay for a bunch of stuff, but in that price tag for the ticket, there's no cost for CO2 emissions or pollution or contributing to global warming and climate change. That cost on the environment is externalized. It's not included in the price tag. We don't actually pay for those costs. They're externalized onto the environment or onto other populations. For example, through exploitative wages, lack of health care, unsafe labor conditions, all these things that help create cheap products for the producer and the consumer. Big reason is because we don't pay the true cost. One reason that people live in sprawled developments is because they don't actually pay the true cost of what it costs to live out there. So sprawl, to define it for you, it's a loose term for the spread of city areas. So informally means that. The technical definition for sprawled development is when there is less than 3 units per acre of land. So less than 3 houses or 3 dwellings per acre. The non-technical definition is dispersed development. We're spread out rather than concentrated. And so Steinberg talks about in the reading that there's so many externalities, social, environmental, health costs, that aren't actually included in the price tag of suburban sprawled living or having these large lawns. And the lawn is really an interesting thing. He talks about the lawn as one of the leading crops in America. We plant twice as much acreage to growing turf as we do to cotton. The amount of turf we grow at the time he was writing the article was equal to at least the size of Kentucky, maybe the size of Florida. At the time he was writing, there was some 58 million homeowners that had lawns, 16,000 golf courses. The lawn industry is a huge multi-billion-dollar business per year, $40 billion per year to be exact in the lawn care industry. This is more, the $40 billion that Americans spend on lawn care is more than the entire gross domestic product of the country of Vietnam. And so why do Americans have this obsession with the green lawn? In part because they don't actually have to pay the true cost. It's not priced in. It's not readily apparent. The water, the resources, the fossil fuels, the pollution, all that is externalized. And so Steinberg goes through this examples of things that are externalized from lawn care. And so I just want to read, it's page 8 through 9. The following is a list of some of the things the turf industry does not want you to know. These are externalities. Between 1994 and 2004, an estimated average of 75,884 Americans per year were injured with lawnmowers. This is roughly the same amount of people injured by firearms. Second, using a gas-powered, this is one of my favorites, using a gas-powered leaf blower for half an hour creates as many polluting hydrocarbon emissions as driving a car 7,700 miles at a speed of 30 miles per hour. 7,700 miles a car can go. That's how much hydrocarbons you emit half hour using a leaf blower. Next one, nearly half of all the households sampled in one study failed to carefully read and follow the label directions when using pesticides and fertilizer. The effect is they usually use way more than they're supposed to, which goes into our soil, our groundwater, and other places in our environment. Approximately 7 million birds die each year because of lawn care pesticides. In the process of refueling their lawn mowers, leaf blowers, and other garden equipment, Americans spill about 17 million gallons of gasoline every summer, or about 50% more oil than marred the Alaskan coast during the notorious Exxon Valdez disaster. You guys might be a little young for that one. Exxon spilled a shitload of oil in the Alaskan coast, and they never really cleaned it up. A single golf course in Tampa, Florida, a state that leads the nation with over 1,000 of these emerald green creations, a single golf course uses 178,800 gallons of water per day. That's enough to meet the daily water needs of more than 2,200 Americans. Suburban households and lawn care operators apply more herbicides per acre on lawns than most farmers spread to grow crops. Remember when we were talking about industrial agriculture and eutrophication of our fresh water, toxifying of our soil, of our air, of our groundwater? Same thing with all these chemicals that home care lawn experts are using. And two more. This is maybe my favorite. Diazinon. For decades, a widely used lawn care pesticide, similar in chemical composition to nerve gas, but touted as safe, was finally banned by the EPA in 2000. And yet, a loophole allowed retailers to go right on selling it as late as 2002. To keep your lawn healthy, they're selling you nerve gas that they're telling you is safe, even though it's been banned by the EPA. Last one, lawn chemicals are commonly tracked into the home or they build up on the carpet, thus placing small children whose developing bodies are far more vulnerable to toxins at risk of chronic exposure. So these are some of the externalities, the things not included in the true cost of having a large lawn. Just a couple of other things from Steinberg. In the second chapter, the Levitt Legacy, this is the factorization of housing. Building housing basically became a factory model at this point. It has to do with a lot of things going on at the time. It's post-World War II. Federal government got involved and began subsidizing building to create jobs and also to provide housing. And so when this money became available, the Levitt and his sons got involved instead of in luxury building, in building low-cost housing. And they built like 17,000 homes in a 4-year period. And so what they did is in the past, when you built a home, you would have to excavate that site. So on the East Coast and the West Coast, we don't have a lot of basements, but on the East Coast, almost everyone has a basement. So you have to excavate that out, fill it in, create a foundation, do all this stuff. To save money and time, instead of doing any of that, what they did is they just bulldozed over the entire lot, poured a concrete slab, that's your foundation, build the house on that, and then plant a lawn over the scarred landscape and heal the land. And with the lawn, concrete slab, the bulldozing, and the subsidized housing, thus the factory model of housing production. Another thing going on at the time is there was all this agricultural land that was being bought up for really cheap by real estate developers. Specifically, Steinberg talks about potato farmers sort of going out of business. And as they go out of business, developers came by and bought up the land at really cheap prices. So, and then with the housing subsidies, they built on it. The result overall of the factorization of housing is that one house was being built at this time every 24 minutes, truly like a factory. And they would even brag that each house only took up 12% of the lot. You want to know why we have sprawl? These are some of the reasons. There's also several other developments that go into the rise of the lawn. cultural status markers, having the space, having the time to take care of it, the money to pay people to take care of it. Also technological changes, the rise of the powered mower is essentially what democratized the lawn. It used to be reserved sort of for the affluent. With the powered mower, you don't need to have money to pay people to take care of your lawn. You can mow it yourself. And so technology also spread this cultural development. And so literally, what are we doing? It takes over 2 inches a week to water a lawn. And I mean, in California, we don't even have water. So much water goes into the lawn that it actually leaches the soil of nutrients and minerals needed to make the plants grow. Then when we mow the lawn, instead of letting the clippings stay to let that decaying vegetation re-enter the soil as nutrients, we remove them because it doesn't look pretty, right? Like what people think it should look like that. Because we remove the potential fertilizing decaying matter, we have to use artificial fertilizer to keep the lawn growing. This keeps it growing, needs more water, it grows fast, has to be cut. You get rid of the clippings, it's not being fertilized, you have to add fertilizer. So we water, we fertilize, we mow, and we repeat. They said people spend like a day to half a day a week working just maintaining their lawn. For fucking what? How did we get on board this? Right? And so that's sort of what Steinberg goes through. He goes through all these developments that led to the rise of the lawn, which is not a sustainable thing to be doing. And again, there's other things that come into play. The Federal Housing Administration, federal policy, the federal interstate highway system makes traveling out to these areas possible at this time. GI Bill allowed soldiers to buy housing. All sorts of other policies and subsidies come together at this time to help incentivize, encourage, and even actually create sprawl. And so what are the consequences of sprawl? There are many, environmental and social. Environmentally, sprawl means we're more spread out. It means we have to drive more. We need more spread out infrastructure to fuel our homes. One of the consequences of this is air pollution. Also increased global warming. Climate change is being driven by increased CO2 emissions through all the fossil fuels we're burning. Lead from gasoline. Lead was banned in gasoline in 1970, but there's still high levels of lead on the streets in many areas. And exposure to this can actually impair cognitive function. There's different studies that have linked lower IQ in the inner city to high levels of lead on the streets. Fossil fuel depletion, resource depletion is another consequence. The U.S. uses more fossil fuels to move around for transportation than most other countries, if not all other countries. Per year, per person driving, the average American uses about 59,000 megajoules. It's a measure of energy. I will not ask you about it, but it's a way to measure internationally energy use. In comparison, the average European only uses about 13,000 megajoules per year. And all of these consequences, all of these environmental impacts are made worse by the more vehicle miles traveled. And vehicle miles traveled, VMT, is on the rise. If you look at the graph, this comes from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. And in Delaware, and I have had a few students from Delaware that can attest to this, it's extremely sprawled out, very spread out, so that if you want to go see a friend, you know you're getting in the car for 20 or 30 minutes. And it's not, or you want to go to school, 20, 30-minute drive. It's not because there's traffic like here. It's because everything is so spread out. So if you look at the graph from 1980 to 2007, the yellow line, transit ridership, that's decreased. Orange, population, no significant increase. Employment, no real change. Vehicles, people own a few more vehicles, but annual vehicle miles traveled has increased at a rate higher than all of these. So it's not proportional to more people. It's not proportional to more cars, to more jobs that people have to drive to. We're just driving more, and part of the reason is because of how we're setting up our cities. They're sprawled. They're spread out. Just a couple of things from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. Because sprawl is such a problem there, they're actually working on redesigning the city, something called re-centralization, to deal with the issues this is going to have in the future. So a couple of facts. Delaware Valley, between 1930 and 1970, the region's land developed at 3.5 times the rate of population growth. Between 1970 and 2005, the land development rate actually accelerated to 7 times the rate of population growth. The resulting erosion of transit options and access has perpetuated a dramatic shift to automobile use. So they haven't been investing in public transit. People have become more and more spread out. The land's being developed at a higher rate than population growth. It's not even comparative. And so people are driving more and more. According to the DVRPC, the Delaware Valley Planning Commission, between 1980 and 2000, the number of automobiles in the region increased by 37%, and the number of vehicle miles traveled increased by 52%, despite a population increase of only 7%. One of the results is in this region, the average commute time ranks among the longest in the United States. Another thing is they have a large baby boomer population. And so by 2025, about 1 in 5 residents in the region are going to be over the age of 65. And not having access to public transit can be a major problem for mobility of this aging population that can't necessarily drive, but needs to get to the store, needs to get to the doctor, and all these other places. And so it's a huge concern. They're talking about re-centralization, essentially focusing development, future development, house building, business building around transit nodes. So build where transportation already exists, rather than building on empty land and then building infrastructure to get out there. They say the re-centralization scenario, it could increase transit ridership by 14% because it's actually convenient now, right? You live and work and have access to public transit all in the same area. It could also reduce vehicle miles traveled by about 1.7 billion miles because people have options. They don't have to drive so far all the time. They'd also add a lot of houses and jobs along these transit nodes. Alternatively, by not doing this, by continuing to sprawl, there'll be less access. People will become more sprawled, and the problems will become more exacerbated. And so it's one alternative, re-centralization, encouraging alternative forms of transportation, and it has several different benefits. I mean, one, it increases mobility choices. It preserves more open space because you're not filling it up with concrete. It reduces energy demands. It lowers household and business expenses because you're not having to travel so far. It's a dense, more compact, mixed land settlement. It shortens the distance between your destinations. It also encourages alternate forms of transportation. Less energy use means less CO2 emissions, and overall it will make the region more sustainable. Also, instead of spending money on trying to fix existing infrastructure, they can spend that money on investing in green and energy efficient technology. And so in turn, that will actually help the region in the future remain economically competitive in this rapidly changing world. So it's one example, one possible solution. This is also from the Delaware Valley Planning Commission. And it's showing you the same thing again over time. The amount of people driving alone to commute is almost 80%. That's only increased. Small amount of people carpooling, but that's decreased. Public transportation, walking and working from home have not increased. People are driving more because that's really one of the only options they have. There's not viable public transit options. And keep in mind, this is not an accident. This was designed for us. Other key consequences of sprawl: specific environmental damage in the form of loss of green space, habitat destruction. You can see this in color in the time-lapse map. It shows the California coast, pre-colonial, circa 1775 and so on, up until 2007 in the bottom right corner in blue. And you can see land use has increased, and it's not simply proportionate to population growth. In fact, there's a highly disproportionate land use. We're not using more space because we have more people. Rather, it's because of the way we're designing our settlement, the way we're planning and structuring policies. Examples: from 1970 to 1990, the New York metropolitan population grew by 5%. During this same time, land use increased by 61%. Cleveland, the population actually declined by 11%, land use up 33%. Phoenix, eating up 1 acre per hour. Chicago, the population grew 4% during this time, land area use up 46%. It's not just environmental consequences, there's also social consequences from sprawl. Damage to our central cities in the form of unemployment and lack of jobs, lack of resources, food deserts. There's huge unemployment in urban and city centers. One reason for that is many jobs have moved out of the city into the suburbs because of sprawl and because it's cheaper to operate in these sprawl developments than in the city. We'll talk more about why that is later on. And the people lowest down on the socioeconomic ladder have been hurt by this most, those that can't afford cars to get out into the suburbs. For example, unemployment in city centers, Chicago from, again, 1970 to 1990. Again, the population increased by 4% only, but land use was up by 46% because people are moving out to the suburbs, sprawling. Employment, as a result, was up 24% in the suburbs, but down 17% during this same time period in the city because the jobs are moving out to the suburbs because it's cheaper to operate out there. Also, the agricultural lands around the city were paved so people can drive out to the suburbs. There's now 2,000 plus vacant manufacturing sites in the cities because, again, the jobs have all moved out. And as in most cities, 25% of the African American population doesn't have access to cars. And so they can't drive out to the suburbs to go to work. Sprawl has hurt those at the bottom of the economic spectrum most. It's not just urban and more impoverished or marginalized populations, it's affluent suburbanites that are affected by sprawl too. Think about the amount of time people spend alone, commuting in their cars, isolated. We are not built for this as humans, right? We're dogs, not cats. We're social creatures. One result of this is we're spending more time commuting, getting to our different destinations, driving alone, and we're spending less time interacting socially. The result is diminishing interpersonal ties, commitments, and social connections. For example, you can see this in changing volunteer rates. And so this great book, Bowling Alone, written by Putnam, sort of talks about this, the collapse and revival of American community. It uses different examples. The example I'll show you is about bowling leagues. And he says in 1980 to 93, bowling was up by 10%. People were bowling more, but doing it as individuals. At this same time, bowling leagues, people coming together as an organized group, was down by 40%. What you're seeing is people are doing more things as individuals versus groups. There's less community. And group interaction is important, right? Social interaction, interpersonal relationships matter. This is key to solving and working on problems collectively, right? As an individual, you might feel passionate about an issue. You might be pissed off, but individuals aren't likely to see collective action as the solution, right? You need a group, an organization for that. If these large organizations and corporations are the major barriers to sustainability, we can't address that as individuals. We have to address it collectively. Groups, grassroots action, bottom-up, social organization, student associations at SDSU on campus. These organizations, these groups get stuff done. A quick shout out to Green Love, right? One of the main sustainability organizations on campus. They're responsible for all sorts of initiatives. The bike lanes, the ban on plastic bag use, involved in the new student union, which is double LEED platinum certified. It's one of the most sustainable buildings in the world, one of 26 that has that certification in the world. Just recently, Green Love and the sustainability organizations, they got the whole university to commit to a climate action plan on paper, meaning SDSU actually back up their words. So groups get things done. This matters. What's more dangerous, ignorance or apathy? Answer, I don't know, ignorant, and I don't give a damn, apathetic. Both of these are problems, right? The price good men pay, I think Plato said this, the price good men or humans pay for apathy, for indifference, is to be ruled by evil men. Right? If you're not involved, someone else will be, and they may not share your values. A competitive edge research study calculated that San Diego County ranks pretty low, actually, when it comes to being civically engaged. They rank 43 out of 51 major metropolitan areas. What is civic engagement? What it sounds like, it being engaged civically with your community, volunteerism, voting, electing leaders that share your values, working with neighbors, participating in groups. These things help communities get things done. They push through adversity, come up with collective solutions to collective problems. And the cities ranked high get more things done. San Diego ranked high in volunteerism, 26, but very low in group participation, 46 out of 51. And so why do we have sprawl? Why do we drive our cars? Why did most of us drive to school if we had actually come to school today alone? And the typical dominant narrative is convenience, the freedom to go where you want, when you want, personal choice. I can leave when I want, I can go when I want, I can come when I want. Comfort, luxury, I can listen to my music. There's all these different reasons. All of it centers around individual choice, right? Because we want to, because it does this for us. Right, the natural lure of the open road, and this is even in car commercials, right, where people are up snowboarding in the mountains and then they take their SUV down and they're surfing and they're all cool and sexy, even though when you're actually driving around California, usually you're on the I-5 getting flipped off, stuck in rush hour traffic, right? Not really what it looks like on the commercials. And so this dominant framing is that sprawl is inevitable, autos are inevitable because of the natural lure of the open road, because people want to drive cars, therefore we have lots of cars. This is what we call a privileged account. It's sort of a taken for granted assumption. Why do we have a lot of cars? Oh, because people like to drive. That is not the whole story. There's a theorist, well known, Michel Foucault, has this concept of embedded power. And Michel Foucault says this is the most powerful kind of power. It's the most effective kind of power because it's invisible. It's embedded. It's built into the way that we think about the world around us, the way that we talk about issues, the discourse that shapes our conversations. It's built in. And because it's built into the way we think and talk and thus behave, it's, again, invisible. It's not noticed. It's taken for granted. Also known as these privileged accounts, sort of the default, the go-to. Oh, why do we drive? Well, we like cars. Why do we have sprawl? Oh, we like to live in the suburbs. That is not the whole story. These are taken for granted assumptions, right? And this is what makes the default framing so effective, is that it's invisible. It's built into how we talk, how we think about and understand different issues. And it frames how we think about stuff, and therefore it frames the solutions we're able to come up with. Examples of privileged accounts of default frames. U.S. energy needs, when politicians talk about oil and fossil fuels and foreign policy, we have U.S. energy needs. Words matter. Right? Think about the connotation of our needs, meaning, wow, we better get this or we're going to be in trouble. What if instead of saying energy needs, we said U.S. energy wants, or U.S. energy uses, or even U.S. energy abuses, right? The way you frame it, the way you say it, shapes how people perceive it and understand it. Embedded power, built into the way that we talk and think. It's unnoticed. It's taken for granted. It's invisible. We have environmental problems. Take shorter showers. Use less water. You, default frame, the individual can solve our problems. Great. 80% of water goes to agriculture in California. Taking shorter showers is never going to solve shit. Doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It does matter, but it's not the majority of the problem. Or another privileged account or discourse, sustainability, environmental stuff, justice, that will cause economic harm and job loss. right? And it's taken for granted. People just assume that to be true when there's no empirical evidence for that, right? We could almost probably say the opposite. And so I want to talk for just a minute about ideology. That's what we're talking about, ideology, your understanding of the world. And if you want to control the world, if you want to have all the power, you want people to do what you want them to do, you want to rule the world, you don't fucking do it with a gun in someone's face. You don't do it with an army. You don't do it with physical force or coercion. Eventually, people will rise up. They will fight back. They will not listen to you. Eventually, the system will break. You don't do it with physical force. If you want to rule the world, you do it via ideology. You do it by influencing the way that people understand their situation and their place in the world. So a quick example to step out of sustainability for just a minute. In my cultural anthropology class, we talk about inequality. And one privileged account, common discourse, or ideology in this country is called the bootstrap ideology. And it's this notion that you too can achieve the wealth, power, status of the elites. You just need to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and try hard enough. And so anthropologists argue that this ideology, and if you don't buy into it, I don't, then it's not an effective ideology for you. But a lot of people in this country do. And so anthropologists argue this is why the bootstrap ideology is why a lot of inequality is actually tolerated in the US, because people believe that they too can move up in life if they just work hard enough, right? We're a merit-based system in which we're all equal, in theory, right? That's not actually true. And so if you want to rule the world, you don't do it with armed force. You don't control people with a gun. You do it by influencing the way they understand the world and their place in it. And so I want to read just a brief excerpt from my cultural anthropology book that talks about, it's talking about ideology and inequality. And going on about how if you try to control people by armed force or an army, eventually that's going to alienate more people. Eventually, it's not going to work. They explain why. And so they go on to talk about ideology and say, it helps elites maintain their privileges if they can influence the perceptions of the underprivileged about why they are underprivileged. For example, if poor people think it is God's will that they are poor, they are less likely to rebel than if they believe they are poor because of exploitation. Or if they think the elite use their property and power to benefit everyone in the society, i.e. trickle-down theory, if they think that, then they are less likely to challenge the elite. Or if they think that a concentration of property and power is inevitable because that's just the way human life is, they will be less likely to resist. Or if they think that they too can acquire property, power, and prestige through their own achievements, they are more likely to put their effort into improving their own position rather than taking the risk of being punished or killed. Finally, if the masses are divided internally on the basis of values, ethnic identities, real threats from enemies, perceived threats from others, religious attachments, regional loyalties, and so forth, then they are less likely to unite in the political arena. To state a general point, if members of the lower strata adopt a set of beliefs that justifies and legitimizes the rewards received by the higher strata, then they are more likely to try to join the system rather than to beat it. In such beliefs, the elite have a powerful and relatively cheap tool with which to dampen opposition to their power and privileges. Moreover, these ideas increase the prestige of the elites. If people believe that inequality is the will of the gods, or that the activities of the elite benefit all, trickle down, or that the elite became elite through intelligence and hard work, then the elite deserve the honor and respect of everyone else. Not surprisingly, elites find it easy to believe such things about themselves. We call those ideas and beliefs that explain inequality as desirable or legitimate ideologies. The bootstrap ideology, it keeps people sort of plugging away in an otherwise absurd system where there isn't necessarily a chance for them to make it to the top. And so back to sort of bringing it into sustainability, ideology, these privileged frameworks, these assumptions that underlie our worldviews and understanding of the way the world works, this is really, really powerful because it's unnoticed. It's built into the way we think and talk and behave. And so it's not even apparent to us. And this allows it to continue to perpetuate. Okay, so traffic problems on San Diego freeways. When most city leaders are asked about traffic problems, what is the default response? We need more freeways. We need more roads. Yet, if you will note, 75% of traffic, 3/4 of traffic is just one person per car. On the slide, 2011 article, debate continues over possible I-5 expansion. There's a big old debate over expanding the I-5 to alleviate congestion because of environmental and other concerns. Well, as of 2016, it is happening. And so they could add up to 6 lanes to the I-5. The typical rationale is traffic jams are a result of not enough freeways. And we need freeways and roads because people want to drive. We love cars. We like to have our own personal vehicles. It's a result of individual choice. This explanation, this focus on the individual's love of cars and therefore we need more roads, this misses so much of the story. It misses the organizational and structural policies that encourage and in fact create sprawl. Quick question. What place in the world has more freeways than any other city in the world? Some hints. This city has more miles or lanes of freeway than any other city in the world. Some of the nation's worst air pollution. 60% of the total land area is devoted to freeways, streets, driveways, parking, and some of the worst traffic. And if you haven't guessed it, the answer is LA, right? And so in Los Angeles, most of the land is devoted to cars. 60%. Devoted to sort of storing and feeding and caring for our cars. And yet it has some of the worst traffic. Our solutions are not solutions. Build more lanes, it's not working. It actually might be making things worse. So critics of adding onto the freeways would say subsidizing the infrastructure, allowing the government and tax dollars to go towards building more freeways, not only does not help cure congestion, but it actually perpetuates it. It creates more of it, right? Because if we expand, then it continues to be convenient to drive. You alleviate congestion, then driving is still going to be a better option than the lack of public transit options we have. It incentivizes people to continue driving, especially because all the money is going into infrastructure for our cars instead of alternative transit options. And so stage 1, cheap empty land. Stage 2, build, expand the road. Stage 3, because you've built, because you've expanded the road, you get more development, more housing, more businesses, and more profit, and more people and more traffic. Stage 4, you need to build and expand the road again. And then you just continue to repeat this. It just continues to sprawl. The rule of thumb is that for each lane you add to the freeway in LA, it alleviates congestion at that point for about 5 years. And then you are right back where you were 5 years ago before you built that lane. It's not a solution. It perpetuates and even it encourages sprawl. And so has all this investment reduced traffic jams? The answer is no. Los Angeles rush hour drivers wasted 136 hours a year in slow or stop traffic in 2002. That's days, just days wasted. If you look at the bottom below the picture on the slide, it says weekly hours of congestion, 85. So 85 hours of the week in LA, the roads are congested. That means 3.5 days, half the week, it's traffic jams. Do we need more and better roads? Do we not have enough freeways? Or should we be asking a different question? Do we have too much sprawl? Are we designing and planning our cities in unsustainable and undesirable ways? Main causes of sprawl. Desirability is one factor. Surveys do show that people say they like living out here, right? It's sort of the best of both worlds, right? You've got the detached single family home, privacy, space, sort of that small town rural feel, but also big city access, right? You're connected via freeways and roads to the city. Sort of the best of both worlds, right? This is not the whole story, and it ignores the organizational structural factors that have led us to this situation. So why do we have sprawl? Increases in vehicle miles traveled in the 1940s, which you can see on the graph, corresponded with several other changes. So you can see from 1920 up till past 2005, up until the 40s, especially 1945, there's a little bit of a tick of an increase in people driving, but it's after the 40s that this really takes off, and vehicle miles traveled increases a lot. This is not an accident, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it corresponds with several other specific changes, some of which we'll discuss. So people start driving a lot more in the 40s. And one reason we have sprawl is we don't have decent public transportation for the most part in the US. Why is our public transportation the worst in the industrialized world? One factor is that trolleys, public transit systems, were purposely and methodically destroyed. General Motors, during the 1940s, under its front company, National City Lines, targeted over 100 major U.S. cities, bought up the public transportation systems in them, slowly dismantled them, converted them to buses, which they purposely made the buses run in a way that no one wanted to ride them. What many of us think of today, or at least 10 years ago when we think of a bus, is because of GM. Buses used to be clean, convenient, efficient, and so what GM did is they converted trolleys to buses to motorize the city, and then stopped taking care of the buses. They stopped servicing them. They started cutting routes. They started making the time in between locations longer and longer. Say it used to be 5 minutes, now it's a half hour. Maybe there used to be 10 buses every hour, now there's one. They made it so shitty, so inconvenient, so smelly and gross that people stopped riding them. And because no one was riding them, they weren't making any revenue. They couldn't justify fixing the buses, and they just let them fall apart. This was not an accident. This was done on purpose. At the time, before national city lines emerged, 9 in 10 people rode public transit. And that means 90% of the market was never going to buy a car. Well, GM couldn't let that happen. They had to get rid of public transit to pave the open road for cars. Also, National City Lines, the front company for GM, the other subsidiaries, the funders, GM, National City Lines is composed of GM, California Standard Oil, which is now Chevron, and Firestone Tires. Those are the owners of public transit National City Lines. There's an excellent documentary made in 1996 called Taken for a Ride that goes through what GM did and this whole streetcar conspiracy, which they were actually found guilty of monopolizing the sale of streetcars. They got found guilty for what they did, and the mastermind behind the whole thing, something like $300 billion of infrastructure they destroyed, the mastermind behind the whole thing got fined $1. And so what you should do now is go ahead and watch the first 17 minutes of the documentary. I think you'll like it. It's pretty good. And then go ahead and come back and join me for the rest of lecture. Okay, so hopefully you went and watched the first 17 minutes of the film to see what GM or National City Lines did. The reason we're all driving cars, the reason we have traffic, that we don't have public transit is not inevitable. It's not an accident. It was done on purpose by a handful of powerful, wealthy people. This dismantling of public transit to make way for freeways and cars. This is also the plot line for the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Here's a map of the rail system in LA before GM bought it up. In its early years, the system was purchased by this real estate tycoon, Henry Huntington, and he started operating it in 1901. At the height, the system contained over 20 streetcar lines, and it had 1,250 trolleys. Most of them ran through the core of LA, but they served nearby neighborhoods from LA to Echo Park, Hancock Park, West Adams, Crenshaw, Lincoln Heights, etc. And so the system was sold off in 1945 by Huntington's estate to National City Lines. Again, National City Lines, owned by GM, Chevron, and Firestone Tires, was buying up public transit across the country at this time. And so and again, later they were convicted of conspiring to monopolize the sale of buses. And so when they bought the train, the trolley system, they converted the lines to buses in the late 40s and early 50s. And then National City Lines started cutting routes, making the buses smelly, inconvenient, not taking care of them, so that they became inconvenient and people didn't want to ride them, and they also weren't a viable option anymore. People started turning to cars. Right? Before this, 9 in 10 people rode the trolley. After, here we are. San Diego also had fairly efficient public transit. Here's a map of San Diego's electric railway system. It operated from 1892 to 1949, and you could get from La Jolla to downtown in 38 minutes. In 1949, the system was sold off and replaced by buses. The buyer was a GM executive, and immediately after, it then took by bus over 1 hour to get to La Jolla. And that slowly just got worse and worse. They slowly dismantled the buses, let them fall apart. Ridership was so low they couldn't justify fixing them, and they got junked. Again, the mastermind behind the whole conspiracy fined $1.